Yet one area of biblical studies where consensus continues unabated is the New Testament's relationship to the Old Testament book of the Song of Solomon. On this point, harmony is striking. Scholars agree that the New Testament contains no direct quotations, explicit literary allusions, or intertextual echoes to the Song of Solomon. And you know that's something that you need to keep in mind in terms of what an allusion is. An analogy is not an allusion. There needs to be a fittedness between the two texts, but the one text needs to enlarge the other text in order for it to be an allusion. This paper argues that there's at least one allusion to the Song of Solomon in the New Testament, and it's found in the book of Acts. An argument for a biblical allusion is layered and nuanced, and consequently I'm going to walk through the argument for this allusion, building one layer upon another layer. I'm going to go from the general to the more specific. So let me begin by thinking about a general concern. And the general concern is that of Jewish superiority. We all learned about the division between the Jews and the Samaritans from Jesus himself, who told us about the Good Samaritan. And every Sunday school teacher who taught us on this story taught us that if you were a Jew, there were no Good Samaritans. The early Jewish believers were not immediately freed from these cultic and cultural biases. A brief survey of the book of Acts reveals some striking divisions that have Jewish superiority at their root. For example, there were problems over provisions. The Christian Hebrew widows were receiving more than the Hellenists. And when the gospel did go to the Gentiles, there's an interesting quote just after Acts 11:19, where we're told after the Jews from Jerusalem were scattered because of the martyrdom of Stephen, when they did go to 3 geographical regions that were distinctly Gentile, they did not speak to the Greeks. So it shouldn't surprise us to find Judea and Samaria built into the program of gospel expansion between Jerusalem and the end of the earth. Notice Jesus' words, Acts 1:8. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. The book of Acts follows that program, but every believer coming out of Jerusalem knew they needed to cross the bridge of Judea and Samaria. And that's exactly the way the book of Acts is laid out. The Samaritan section is in Acts 8:1 through 40. It's parallel to the Judean section in 9:32 through 10:48. And surprisingly, these two sections close with the circumcision party complaining about Peter's involvement. Why? Because Peter had gone to the Gentiles while in Judea. Luke wants us to see that among some in Jerusalem, a Gentile and a Samaritan inclusion in the church is not cause for joy. Separating the Samaritan and the Judean sections is the conversion of Saul. The narrative is out of place geographically. It doesn't take place in Judea or Samaria. It actually takes place in Damascus. So why is it accounted here? Of all the things that might be said, there's one that stands out that's significant. Notice when Ananias is told by God to go fetch Saul, a conversation results. Ananias is hesitant and says, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. Acts 9:13. Notably, this is the first time in the book of Acts that the moniker saint is used in the book of Acts. Our ears ought to perk up. After Paul returns to Tarsus, just after his conversion, or after that section closes out of his conversion, we're introduced to Peter. And Peter is going about here and there, and then we read in Acts 9:32, he, Peter, came down also to the saints who lived at Lydda. Now think about that. He is paralleling the saints in Jerusalem to those saints, meaning those Gentile saints living in Lydda. Lydda was technically in Judea at this time, but it had Samaritan roots. In 145 BC, it was detached from Samaria and made part of Judea. Lydda was complicated. In other words, Luke is making a very simple statement. There are saints in Gentile-populated Judea and Samaria, just as there are saints in Jewish-populated Jerusalem. Can you imagine how this would strike the ear? I want to move to the literary context. That's the general. Let's move a little closer. Just after Saul's conversion, we encounter three stories: Aeneas, Dorcas, and Cornelius. All of them involve Peter in this Judean area. All three stories take place in that particular region. But the interesting thing is that we are given the name of that particular region, but it's not the name we expect. We don't hear Judea, and we don't hear Samaria. What we do hear is Sharon. Now, that's significant because it comes at the close of the Aeneas story, Acts 9:35, and Luke writes, "And all the residents of Lydda and Sharon saw him, and they turned to the Lord." The name Sharon would have struck the ear of the Jewish reader with familiarity. Sharon was a much-loved geographical region, and for good reason. Sharon was a large, fertile plain in western Israel with 5 rivers flowing east and west across the 3 valleys running north and south. It was the epitome of fertility, growth, and life. What is more, this is the only occurrence of Sharon in the entire New Testament. That is staggering. Sharon is a word that would be easy to pass over in any exposition of the text, but that would be a mistake. The location of Sharon is mentioned only 6 times by comparison in the Old Testament. Now I'm thinking about the Septuagint at this point. 2 of those occurrences, 2 of the 6, occur in 1 Chronicles and simply reference pasture land, the pasture land of Sharon. However, the remaining 4 occurrences are metaphorical and eschatological in orientation. And what is more, these 4 Old Testament occurrences are thematically linked to all 3 stories in Acts chapter 9. The first story that Luke tells is the Aeneas story. And he brings the reader into the closest possible relation to Isaiah chapter 35. Now, that's one of those references to Sharon. Actually, it's it's at Isaiah 33 and 35, and the 2 go hand in hand. In Isaiah 33, there's a famine in Sharon, which is ridiculous if you know how fertile the plain is. But in 35, Sharon becomes, once again, a lush, beautiful land. And it is, Isaiah 35, about the eschatological highway of holiness. Now, what I want you to notice is the lexical relationship that stands between Isaiah 35 and the Aeneas story in Acts chapter 9. Starting in verse 32, in just 4 verses, listen to some of the lexical parallels that are here. In Isaiah 35:8, it says that there will be a highway of holiness, and the holy will walk on it. Acts 9:32 tells us that there are holy ones living in Lydda. In Isaiah 35:3, the parallelumina will be made firm. Aeneas is described as paralyzed, a paralleluminos, in Acts 9:33. And in Isaiah 35:10, we're told that the ransomed of the Lord will, apostrepho, turn, which is what the residents of Lydda and Sharon are doing in Acts 9:35, epistrepho. The 4 lexical parallels to Isaiah 35 in the 4 verses of Acts 9:32 through 35, Sharon, holy, lame, turn, enlarges our understanding of the eschatological fulfillment that was brought about by Christ. Somebody reading the Aeneas story and hearing those four lexical parallels can't help but think of Isaiah 35's highway of holiness. For the time being, I'm going to set aside the Dorcas story and move to the story of Cornelius. This takes place in Caesarea, which is also in Sharon. Reading the story, we realize that the reference to Sharon in Isaiah 65:10 thematically links to this story. Here, the prophet Isaiah begins by addressing the Gentiles, which seems odd, but Paul makes that affirmation in Romans 10:20, though slightly modifying the quote to indicate that not only was he ready to be found by those who did not seek him, but that he had been found by them. And in Acts 10:1, the Lord made himself known to a Gentile in Sharon named Cornelius. Now, in Acts chapter 10, we find Peter experiencing a vision, a sheet with clean and unclean animals on it. The result is that Peter is told to kill and eat. Now, if we compare this text to Isaiah 65, we find an eschatological enlargement, a thematic connection. In Isaiah 65, verses 2 through 7, the people of Israel have declined to the point that they are acting like the nations. In fact, verse 4 ironically says that they are eating pig's flesh, unclean animals. But the point is not diet, but rebellion. Israel had become like the nations, and thus God turns to the Gentiles. He would be found by those who did not seek him. And it's at this very point of Peter's vision that we find the commonality. The unclean Gentiles were no longer to be seen as unclean. Instead, as Isaiah 65:10 says, Sharon would become the pasture land of the remnant of Israel and the Gentiles who turned to him. And Isaiah 65:13, they would never be hungry again. Now, let's turn to the middle story, that of Dorcas, Acts 9:36 through 43. The last metaphorical and thematic reference to Sharon in the Old Testament. In the Song of Solomon, chapter 2, very familiar. I am a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys. And this is where we find the intersection of the Song of Solomon with the New Testament. And so I want us to think thirdly about the thematic coherence between the Song of Solomon and Acts. According to Richard Hayes, as summarized by Greg Beale, in order for thematic coherence to be present, quote, the alleged Old Testament allusion is suitable and satisfying in that its meaning in the Old Testament not only thematically fits into the New Testament writer's argument, but also illumines it, end quote. If the Dorcas story is viewed as part of a threefold pattern of stories, each of which is linked to an Old Testament Sharon text for the sake of expanding the eschatological aspect of those stories, then Hayes' criteria for illumination has been satisfied. But it remains to be seen if there's a suitable and satisfying theme existing between the Song of Solomon and the Dorcas story. And that's what I want to seek to establish now. The church in Joppa had lost a beloved saint. They did not passively wait for Peter to arrive. Rather, they prepared the body for burial, and then they summoned the apostle. When Peter came, he permitted the widows to recount Tabitha's deeds before dismissing them, choosing to remain alone with the body. The question of why he puts them out of the room is an interesting one, and I don't want to go into a great detail about that, but the way in which Peter learns to do this is because he's experienced it. In Luke chapter 8, 49 through 56, Jairus, a synagogue ruler, implored Jesus to come and heal his child. Jesus is delayed, the child dies, Jesus shows up, puts everyone out of the room except for Peter, John, and James, and then he takes the child by the hand and he says, "Child, arise." The correspondence is striking. It's the very thing that Peter does with Dorcas. Now, I don't want to lose sight of the main point of the text. Peter called Tabitha, Dorcas, to arise, to get up from her deathly slumber. And that is the emphasis we see in the second chapter of the Song of Solomon, specifically verses 10 through 13. Now here's the really interesting thing, at least lexically. When you compare Luke 8, if you see that as the backdrop for Acts chapter 9, what's striking is that if that is the backdrop, Jesus says, agairo, arise. But when Peter speaks to the dead girl, he says, anisting. And that, interestingly enough, though it doesn't match Luke, matches the Song of Solomon. There in verse 10, we read of Song of Solomon, anasta elf, which is then repeated in verse 13, anasta elf. And strikingly, these verses form an inclusio wherein the beloved, using springtime imagery, calls his bride to arise from bed and come with him. Consequently, while the Song of Solomon 2, 10 through 13 is not about physical resurrection in its original literary sense, its imagery of awakening, rising, and the transition from winter to spring participates in a broader biblical pattern of life from death symbolism, which crowds in between verses 10 through 13. Within a canonical and typological framework, this pattern can be seen as resonant with, though not explicitly predictive of, resurrection and new creation. And thus there is clearly a suitable thematic fit between the two texts, with mention of Sharon providing a prophetic and eschatological framework for understanding not only the Dorcas story, but also the Aeneas and the Cornelius stories. Let me finally, having established the literary context and the thematic coherence, move to what is often the first indication of an allusion between two texts, and that's the lexical correspondence. An allusion, according to Beale, may be simply defined as a brief expression consciously intended by an author to be dependent on an Old Testament passage. What is more, he continues, the telltale key to discern an allusion is that of recognizing an incomparable or unique parallel in wording, syntax, concept, or cluster of motifs in the same order or structure. Now, an example of this would be, and Dale Allison gives this in his work on the Sermon on the Mount, an example of this would be to say, brother, anger, altar, murder. And he would say, where do you hear that? Well, you obviously hear that in the Sermon on the Mount. But he would go on to say, you obviously hear that in the Cain and Abel story. The fascinating thing is, if you compare in the Septuagint the Greek of the Sermon on the Mount with the Cain and Abel story, what you find is not four comparable lexemes. What you'll find is one that's common to both stories, and that's adelphos. The other words are just orality. They're a recognition by speak. When I say those words, you immediately recognize them, but they're not written words in the text that correspond one to another. And because of that, it's likely, Allison thinks, that he has a probable case for an allusion based on orality and thematic context, which drives audience recognition. The correspondence between the Song of Solomon and the Book of Acts is actually stronger than Allison's proposed correspondence between the Sermon on the Mount and the Cain and Abel story because of its twofold correspondence, chirographic and orality. The story of the resurrection of Dorcas in Acts 9:36 through 43 has several fascinating textual and oral links to chapter 2 of the Song of Solomon. In Acts 9:36, we're told that in Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha, an Aramaic appellation which, when translated into Greek, is Dorcas. Both words, Tabitha in Aramaic, Dorcas in the Greek, mean gazelle. But this symmetrical linguistic redundancy raises the obvious question. Why does Luke tell his readers that the Aramaic name Tabitha is Dorcas in the Greek when both denominate the same creature? My contention is that Luke is pointing Jewish readers to the Septuagint version of the Song of Solomon. In verse 9 and 17 of the second chapter of the Song of Solomon, we read that the beloved is like a Dorcas, a gazelle. The attentive reader will realize that in Acts it is Tabitha who is the Dorcas, whereas in the Song of Solomon the beloved is the Dorcas. However, when we remember that union between the Shulamite and the beloved, he belongs to me, I belong to him, we have a shared identity. The Shulamite expresses this union in 2:16, saying, "My beloved is mine, and I am his." What is more, she's not alone. All believers share this same union. And though she is, in 2:1, a lily of Sharon, her Dorcas, or her beloved, grazes among the lilies. Song of Solomon 2:16, which is a beautiful picture of Christ among his people. The second aspect of lexical correspondence is the call to arise, anistemi. After having been shown the fruit of Tabitha's faithfulness by the widows, Peter put them all out of the room and prayed, "Tabitha, arise." And she arose. It is striking that in the Song of Solomon 2:10 and 13, the beloved says to the Shulamite, "Anasta," anistemi. And thus the use of the word anistemi is also common to both narratives. The third word common to both texts is, strikingly, Peter. The Apostle Peter was sent for by the people of Joppa in the Acts story, and so we're not surprised to find his name, Petros. But when we turn to the Song of Solomon, we find Petrus in verse 14. Here the beloved addresses his bride, saying, "O my dove, in the clefts of the Petrus, in the crannies of the cliff, let me see your face, let me hear your voice." Thinking ahead to the New Testament, it's hard to put Matthew 16:18 out of mind. The beloved finds his people built upon the Petrus of Peter's confession. According to Beale, quote, "Some believe that an allusion must consist of a reproduction from the Old Testament passage of a unique combination of at least 3 words. Though this may be a good rule of thumb, it remains possible that fewer than 3 words or even an idea may be an allusion," end quote. The oral mention of the word Dorcas, arise, and Peter should be enough to activate a well-informed Bible student's memory in the direction of Acts 9:36 through 43. But are these parallel words in Acts enough to allude to the Song of Solomon? Not on their own, but built upon the literary foundation we've constructed with the flanking 2 stories. These parallels are more than enough to suggest that the Song of Solomon was in the mind of Luke as he wrote about the resurrection of Dorcas, the central of the 3 stories, all set in the place or in the plain of Sharon.